Hello and welcome to Fin24. Today, Minister Nene presented the first budget of our fifth democratic parliament. Minister Nene stressed that on the one hand, our developmental path is limited by the resource constraints of the current economic outlook. On the other hand, it seeks to lift these constraints by supporting innovation and making markets work better. We now speak to experts to gain some insight into the overall economic outlook. With me in studio today, we have Shamir Khan from Element Investment Managers, and we have Toko Madonka, co-director of the AIDC and member of the Budget Justice Movement. Welcome.
Thank you, Mashika.
Shamir, let's get right into it. What are your views on the overall economic outlook from Budget 2015?
So I think it's quite a difficult economic environment we find ourselves in. And by and large, it's a relatively well-balanced budget from our point of view. I think there are some questions raised in terms of where you're going to increase taxes. We see the normal culprits coming up, sort of sin taxes and a bracket creep in terms of corporate taxes. Some people would say that it is probably easier to capture more tax with a more general tax, such as maybe raising VAT, but then also zero costing certain items, which would be beneficial to the lower and middle income.
But did we not see from the budget overall that nobody wants to be upsetting the apple cart here? There was no real big surprises. And Toko, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I have a few highlights from the minister's speech. I think he started off very well, talking about people living in shacks, schools without sanitation, people living without sanitation, patients without care. But there was no sense of urgency in the next set of pronunciations. So we would have liked to have seen a stronger stance and a far more aggressive position around tax policy and the opportunities that the personal income tax review could have provided in terms of providing much needed resources to support greater increases in social grants, for example, for ensuring that our national health insurance can be paid for and functioning, that our health system really gets sorted out at the provincial level, and that we see greater movement and capacity within our municipalities to provide for basic services.
So, Toko, can I ask, do you see our budget 2015 as having missed the opportunity to take advantage of avenues that could really have helped upliftment on socioeconomic places in our society?
Absolutely. You know, one of my colleagues said it's a cowardly reshuffling in terms of the personal income tax. And at the same time, there's no sense that you know, people are really struggling. 1 in 4 South Africans are going hungry. It's embarrassing, the conditions under which many South Africans are expected to live and survive and work, and to talk about the UIF in terms of the amount of money that could be unlocked to pay the unemployed to be able to provide much needed demand in our economy that we're just not seeing. So we see our social protection, and I mean the minister did talk about a review around our social protection system in South Africa, but we're not seeing it going further enough. And the many protests that we're seeing across the country that are becoming more and more violent and are growing more and more in terms of tribalism or ethnicism and xenophobia is an indication that government is not doing enough through the public purse to enable people to bring themselves out of poverty.
So what we are actually saying is that this opportunity could have been taken to alleviate poverty on a far greater level than what it has been used for. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, when you say it, then it sounds like it's a very easy thing to do. But there are two sides to the equation. There's the cost side and there's the income side. So it's fine to say we got to spend more on the poor, we got to spend more on social service, and most of us want that from a humane point of view. The problem is finding the funding for that. And the difficulty you have at the moment is that there is a very small income tax base paying a lot of money. So it's a question of how do you get more people either into the income tax base, or how do you get more from the system? And I think one of the issues, you'll see that corruption comes up a lot of times in his speech. And I think that is a silent drain on the economy. And if we can start plugging that gap, then you should see more income available for social
Perhaps
spending.
if we stopped staying silent
Mhm.
on that, we might also, get in a little bit more there. What do you think, Toko?
Well, I think often economists, particularly conservative economists, like to set up this tension between sort of general middle class taxpayers, confidence in the system and the public's service to deliver versus corruption. What is often not said is that the corruption is both in the public and the private sector. And we were very pleased to hear the Minister talk about illicit financial flows going out of the country, the issue with transfer pricing, what we've seen around Lonmin, for example. So we recognize that it's not an either or. We need to address corruption, yes, and I think the Minister made some very good pronunciations around greater control, what we talk about sunshine clauses, making sure that there's the more the transparency around open contracting, both in public and private, the more we see that. And South Africa is a signatory to the Open Government OGP initiative, and so we would expect him to say something strong. What I would like to disagree with my colleague here is that everybody pays tax. So in terms of this narrow tax base, in terms of personal income tax, yes, it is narrow because we live in an extremely unequal society. And so those who can should pay tax. And so the current burden, as you rightly point out, could be expanded if we start looking at the way in which workers are paid. So we also want to talk about the illicit financial controls, or the corruption is actually a wage evasion to a certain extent. And wages are not a cost to the economy. They provide demand. And so when we're talking about demand, we're talking about money in the hand. So people can actually go out and buy the services.
Again, it is an opportunity that was missed.
Completely.
Shamir, we've got something that has come through. We have Justice Malala has commented on our social media platform. He said that it is sad that emerging and developing markets are growing at 4.5%, while Nene says we will do a measly 2%. That may be revised down. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you need to see it in context. Obviously, the electricity issue is a major issue because it affects production both in manufacturing but also mining. And mining is still a big component of our exports. Also, you'll see that commodity prices have come down. So if you compare us, the country to compare us probably closer to is in Australia rather than other emerging markets. And you'll see they are also looking at potentially downgrading their GDP, and they've actually cut interest rates.
So it's not as unusual as what it may seem.
No, and also you got to remember that some of those emerging markets in terms of their development are behind us. So you're seeing a lot of infrastructure development going into those countries, which is boosting their GDP.
Toko, we also have a comment from Muzi who says that when they said Eskom rates will increase, it shows that government is punishing the poor. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a component in which we would raise concern around these increases in terms of the electricity tariffs. If it's targeting big business, then we have no issues with it because we want to see a far more responsible business sector that moves towards a low carbon, far more smart energy use than we're currently seeing. They've been getting away with getting very cheap energy and abusing it to a certain extent. And so we want to see that dealt with. But from the perspective of the budget justice movement, and if you were following at all the United Front's calls, we are extremely aware of the impact that these have on poor communities. And in fact, these levies may not even be relevant to many communities because they can't even afford to access electricity because they're not living in decent housing anyway. So what we would want to see is a far more brave minister talking about gender-based violence, which we didn't hear. We heard again for the 5th year running empty promises around the NHI and NHI financing. When are we going to see this paper? It's actually making a mockery of Parliament that we have our ministers come before Parliament, promise to produce these documents, and then nothing happens. A year again later, we're getting a promise to deliver. So we really need to see a much stronger, braver,
much more aggressive
minister that sees the urgency that many people are dealing with on the ground.
On a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Toko. Thank you, Shamir. Please stay tuned to Fin24 as we continue our Budget Day broadcast. We'll be back soon looking at the tax implications of Budget 2015.